Hello, this is Matt from Matt Heaney Apps, and welcome to episode 5 in our series teaching you how to make the full iPhone game disappear in discs. So far, we have our discs spawning around the screen, we have a score system, we have a level system, and we started to polish a few things off. But it's still not really much of a game, so in this video, we'll make the discs start to shrink, which is the entire point of the game, and if a disc does entirely shrink, we will run game over, where we will move into a new scene, which will show our final score, our highest score, and give us the option to restart the game or to exit. Okay, so let's jump back into Xcode. So back into Xcode and back to the game scene. So as I said, today is all about game over. And in disappearing discs, the game is over when a disc entirely shrinks down to nothing and it disappears. So the point of the game is to tap the disc before it shrinks and disappears. With that in mind, we will begin by making the discs shrink. So in the game scene, we are going to go to our spawn new disc function, where we have all of our code for a random coloured disc to appear in a random location somewhere on the screen. So here, what we want to happen is, when we add a new disc, we want to make it start shrinking straight away. We are then going to say, if that disc completely shrinks, and therefore reaches a scale of 0, then play a game over sound effect and run game over, so end the game. And in this game, what we're going to do is when you've reached game over, we will change scene into the game over scene. And there you will see your final score and your highest score, and you can restart the game. So one step at a time, after we have added our disc to the scene, we will make the disc run some actions so it actually does something. So let's take the disc and say .run action, and here we can make it do something. So we want to set up a sequence because we want the disc to shrink, and then once it's finished shrinking, play the sound effect for game over and then run game over. So this would be an skaction.sequence. As this is a sequence, it is a list of actions, so it is an array, so we need square brackets. So let's drop some lines so we can type this in nice and easy, make it nice and easy to read, so it'll be nice and easy to understand. First thing that we want to do in our sequence is make the disc shrink and disappear. So the first thing it will do is an action, which will be scale to, and here we can say what we want it to scale to and over how long. So we want it to scale to 0, 0 being nothing, 1 being normal size, with a duration of 3 seconds. Okay, so just with that, our discs are now going to shrink. We will add to this in a second, but for now, let's hit run and let's check this out. So here is the game so far. We have our first disc, which remember we set up separately and differently to our new spawning discs. We want to give them the first disc for free, get them into the game. But now, when we tap this disc, the new discs will start to shrink. But if a disc completely vanishes, nothing happens yet. Okay, so the shrinking is working nicely. All we have to do now is set it up so if a disc completely shrinks and disappears, we will run game over. So back into Xcode and back to our sequence. So what we want to do is say when the disc has finished shrinking, we now want to run our sound effect. Now we could just say comma and set up a brand new action for the sound effect. But as you may remember from last time, if we do this here, there's always going to be just a little bit of lag the first time the sound effect plays. So we will delete this, and instead we will set that action up globally and then just run it, so then we will get no lag. So up to the top, outside of a function, we will set up the action here. So let play game over sound effect. This will be an skaction.playSound file named, and the sound effect is gameoversound.wav. This one, only a really simple sound effect. So gameoversound.wav. Make sure you have the same capital letters in this bit here as the file name does, otherwise it will not run. And wait for completion will set to false, and I will explain why in just a second. So back to our sequence, we can now say comma, and then we want to run our new action, which we set up and called play game over sound effect. So the disk will now shrink, and if this action finishes, and therefore the disk will fully shrink, the next action will play, which will be our sound effect. So we now have the disks getting smaller, and then our game over sound effect playing. But just that sound effect isn't enough. We want to run some form of game over. Okay, so before we can set that up in our sequence, we need a brand new function. So find some room which is not in another function. We will say func. We will call it run game over, like so. And here, in just a few moments, we will code what we want to happen when we reach game over. So make a quick note to yourself. Here we will code game over. So now that we have this function that is going to hold all of our code for game over, in our sequence we can say run that function. Now a sequence has to be made up of actions, and to run a function in a sequence we will say skaction.runBlock and then our function name, which is run game over, no brackets there, just like this. So this is our completed sequence. The disk will now run an action, which is going to be a sequence, which will run these actions in order. It's going to completely scale down, and if this finishes, we're going to run the game over sound effect, and with the game over sound effect, we will run some code for game over. Now, as you may remember, our game over sound effect action had wait for completion set to false. And we had to do that because now what's going to happen is this sound effect will start to play, and straight away the next action in the sequence will run, which is what we want. With our sequence, we can now set up exactly what we want to happen when we run game over. And all of this code will be in our new function just here. Now all we want to do is move scene into our game over scene, which we set up way back when in part 2. And here we will have a new scene which will have all of our game over information. Final score, high scores, and so on. So all we want to do is move into this scene, and here we can take care of everything. So back in the game scene and in the run game over function. So all we want to do is move scene. So we will say let, and we will call this scene to move to, and scene to move to is going to hold all the information about the scene that we want to go to and how we should set up that scene. So this would be the game over scene, because that is the scene that we want to move to. And we're going to pass this some information about how big this new scene should be. So we're going to say size, and as we want it to be the same as the current scene, we are just going to say self.size. Very important, because if the scene is bigger or smaller, it's just going to look really weird. Now similar to that, what we have to do is say scene to move to .scale mode. Again, affects how the scene actually looks. And we want this to be the exact same as the current scene, so we get no nasty surprises. So we will just say self.scale mode. Okay, so we're just passing across the same size and the same scale mode as this scene, so the scene will be set up and therefore look similar. So that's all the information about the scene that we want to go to. We're now going to set up a transition for how we want to get to the scene. Again, just making it look and feel a little bit more polished. So we will call this scene transition, and this will be an SK transition dot, and we can use whatever transition we fancy. I'm going to use fade with duration across 0.2 seconds. So it'll just fade out into our new scene. So we now have the information about where we want to go and how we're going to get there. All we have to do is actually change scene. So what we're going to do, we'll say self.view, and the view is what is presenting the scene. So if we change scene from the game scene to the game over scene, all we have to do is change the scene that's currently presented by the view. We need an exclamation mark for the view, dot present scene, and now here all we're going to say is go to scene to move to, which is storing all that information that we need, so it knows to go to the game over scene with the size and the scale mode, with the transition scene transition, this from here, which is storing all that information so it knows it's going to fade. And to change scene, that's all we need. So to quickly review, when we spawn a new disk, we are saying shrink down to 0, and if this action finishes before we tap it and delete it, and therefore the sequence will continue. So if it completely shrinks to 0, play the sound effect, and then run game over. And in run game over, we are changing scene, and before we hit run and we check it out, there's one small potential glitch we have to fix. Only very, very small. And this potential glitch is because when we tap on the disk, we are saying fade out over 0.1 seconds before we delete the disk. That means this disk is not being deleted for a tenth of a second after we tap the disk. And because it's not being deleted, in that 0.1 seconds, that disk sequence is still running, so it's still shrinking. It hasn't been deleted yet, so everything is still going on. So you could tap the disk, get your point, but as it's fading out, it still entirely shrinks and it will run game over, even though we tapped it. So all we got to do is when we tap on the disk, take tapped node, which remember represents our disk, and stop it from shrinking. So dot remove all actions. So now when we tap on the disk, it will stop shrinking, so therefore game over can't run because we've now tapped it, and then it can fade out and remove, and potential glitch avoided. Okay? So now our disk will get smaller. If it completely shrinks, it will run game over. So before we set up our game over scene, let's check it out. So with our game, if we tap some disks and we now let one completely disappear, we'll play our game over sound effect and it will take us into the game over scene. Now at the moment, there's nothing in the game over scene. That's why it's taken us to this black screen. But game over is working because it shrinks, the sound effect plays, and we change scene. All we have to do now is set up the game over scene and game over is done. So back into Xcode, let's quickly delete that comment because we've done game over now. And let's jump over into our game over scene.swift. And as you can see, at the moment, there is absolutely nothing in our game over scene. That is why when we move to the game over scene, we get that black screen. So all we have to do is set up our game over scene. Now, quick warning, the vast majority of the game over scene is just making labels. We're going to have a label to show the word game over, one to show our score, one to show the highest score, a restart button and an exit button, which will all be set up as labels. So we will smash through the labels. But here we have a few important skills to cover, which include getting the score from the game scene and using it in the game over scene, and working with a high score. Okay, so it's not all labels, I promise. So we want all of our labels and our background to be on the game over scene straight away, as soon as we move into it. So we will use our did move to view function. And to start with, our game over scene needs a background. So let background, this is an SK sprite node because it's an image. Image named, we will use our background, which is called disks background, same one as the game. So disks background. We'll give it a size, which will be the same as the scene. So background.size equals self.size, so self being the scene. Give it a Z position of 0, so it's always at the bottom. Everything else will have a higher Z position, so therefore you will always be able to see it in front of the background. We will give it a position in the center of the screen. So this is the exact same as what we did when we set up the background in the game. And then we'll just add it to the scene with self.addChild background. Great, so our game over scene now has a background. And the first label we want to do will say game over in big text, so it's really obvious to the gamer what's happened. So we will say let this be called game over label. It will be an SK label node, and it will use the custom font Pusab. We will give this some text by saying game over label.text, and it will just say game over. We will give it a font size of 140. All these font size and positions, I've kind of just got to by playing around with different font sizes and positions until it looked pretty good. That's where I'm getting these numbers from. Give it a position halfway across the screen. So xv self.size.width divided by 2, and a y position of 3/4 of the way up the screen. So self.size.height times by 0.75. We will give it a font color of white, even though by default it will be white. But Every now and then, sometimes these defaults get changed and code gets mixed up, so I always like to put it in there anyway, just in case. And we will give it a Z position of 1, which is higher than the background, so we can always see the label. Add it to the scene, and there we go, that's our first label done. Now our second label is going to show our final score. So let final score label, this again is an SK label node, font named Pusab, and now we want to do, set our label up so it shows our final score. So .text will be score colon, and then we want to show the variable called score number from the game scene. We've done that before with our score label in the game scene, so we could just say / and then score number between brackets to show a variable. Only problem is, in the game over scene has no idea what score number is, because we declared it in the game scene and we've only used it in the game scene. So that could be a bit of a problem. Not to worry, nice and easy fix. Back into the game scene, and let's find where we've declared score number. At the moment, it's declared within the game scene. So all of this stuff is in the game scene. So what we're going to do, we will take this, our declaration of score number, and we will move it to be above where the game scene starts. So now score number is declared outside of the game scene, and therefore we can use it anywhere in any scene. Okay, so we declare it, we will add to our score in the game scene, and then we will show it in the game over scene. One really quick addition to this, because we are now no longer setting score number back to 0 every time we load up the game scene, because we're only declaring it once the entire time, let's jump into the did move to view in the game scene and set score number back to 0, because otherwise the score from the previous game will be carried over. Okay, so we've now made score number global within all of the scenes, and because of that we've had to manually set score number back to 0 when we start the game. So back into the game over scene, and you can now see we can show score number in our label. So that's actually a really important skill. So let's carry on. So final score label, we have a font size of 70, a position of halfway across the screen and 60% of the way up, dot height times by 0.6. Let's give it the font color. So dot font color equals sk color dot white color. A Z position of 1 for our layering, and add it to the scene. Before we move on to do our high score and our buttons to restart the game, let's check out our score label and let's have a look at how our game over scene is looking so far. So hit run. So let's play the game. Let's get a score of, say, 12. Let a disk vanish, and we're taken into the game over screen with our background. It says game over and it shows our score. Great, awesome, so it's already starting to take shape. So back into our game over scene, and our next label is going to show our high score. Now before we can show the high score in the label, we have to figure out what the high score actually is. And to do that, we have to work our way through a number of steps. Number 1, we have to load up the current saved high score. Number 2, we have to check to see if we've set a new high score. And then number 3, if we have set a new high score, update the current high score to the new high score. So one step at a time. Let's load up the current high score. Now in apps and in games, there's an area where we can save data. This is called the NS user defaults. And here we can store information and data, so even if the game gets closed, we can then access it at a later date. Okay, so we need to go into the NS user defaults to load and save our high score. And to get access to the NS user defaults, what we will do, we will say let defaults equals NS user defaults with some brackets. So now we can get some information from the NS user defaults by using defaults. So now let's load up our high score. We will say var, and this will be called high score number. Now this is var, not let, because we might have to update the value of high score number. And this will equal defaults, so the NS user defaults, dot integer for key. So we're saying grab us a number from the NS user defaults, which is saved with the reference high score saved. And as you will see in a moment, when we save our high score, we will also save it to high score saved. So now we're loading up whatever we have stored in high score saved and setting that value to high score number so we can use it. If this is the very first time you have played the game, then this obviously won't have anything saved there, so it will load 0. So now we have our high score loaded up, we have to check to see if we have set a new high score. So we will say if score number, so the score from the previous game, the one we have just finished playing, is greater than high score number, therefore we've set a new high score because our score is higher than our personal best. Then we will update the value of high score number to match score number. So if our high score was 10 and we just got 20, take high score and set it to 20, so updated that value. And if this is the case, we will now save the new high score, so next time we will load up the new high score. And to save, we are going to say defaults, our NS user defaults, dot set integer, so set a number. We are going to save the value of high score number, and we will save it with a reference of high score saved. So you'll copy this down, because these have to be the 100% exact same. Otherwise this won't work, because we'll be saving data in one place, loading it from another place, so it won't work. You won't get any errors, but it just won't work. So now we have our high score. Quick review, we said take high score number and set that to be the value of our saved high score. And then if we have set a new high score, update high score number and then save this in our NS user defaults so we can load it up next time to allow our high score to be stored, making it work. Okay, so now with that we can set up our high score label. So let high score label, this will be an SK label node with the custom font of Pusab. It will have some text that will say high score, and then it will show high score number. It will have a font size of 70. It will have a white font color. A Z position of 1. And a position which will be halfway across the screen and halfway up the screen. And let's add it to the scene. So there we go, we now have our high score set up and our high score label. So we now just need 2 more labels and then our game over scene is fully created, and these labels will work as buttons. So these labels will say restart, which if we tap we will move back into the game, and exit, which if we tap we will move into the main menu, and the main menu we will set up in the next video. So just 2 more labels, I promise. We're going to call this one restart label, SK label node, font named Pusab. We will give this some text that says restart. So we're going to set these up the exact same as a normal label, but we'll make them work as buttons. We will give these a font size of 75, a font color of white, Z position of 1, a position of halfway across the screen and 30% of the way up the screen, so dot height times 0.3. And now as we want this to work as a button, we have to give it a reference name. So restart label.name, and we will call it restart button, because in just a few moments we will set up our touches began function to figure out if we touch this label or not, a bit like what we did with the discs in the game scene. And let's add this one to the scene, restart label. And the very last one will be our exit label. So let exit label, SK label node, font named of Pusab, give it some text that will say exit, because if we tap this one, we'll get taken back to the main menu. Font size of 75. Font color, white. Z position of 1 for the layering. And a position of halfway across the screen. And 20% of the way up. Times 0.2. And we'll also give this one a reference name, because again this will be a button. We'll call it exit button. And let's add it to the scene. There we go. That is now all of our labels done for the game over scene. I know it was a lot, I do apologise. So we now have all of our labels. We have a label that says game over, we have one that shows our score, one that shows our high score, a restart label that will work as a button, and an exit label that will work as a button. Before we set up these buttons, let's hit run and let's have a look at our game over scene. So let's have a quick play of the game. Let's get a score of say 12. Let a disc disappear. Take it into the game over scene. It says game over, shows our score, shows our high score, and it says restart and exit, which don't actually do anything yet. So now we can set up the buttons. So back into the game over scene, and we will set up our buttons. So we need our touches began function, and this, if you remember, is the function that's going to run when we tap on the screen. Now all we have to do is pretty much the exact same as what we did in the game scene when we figured out if we had tapped on a disc. Remember, we had to get the information about our touch, we had to figure out where we touched on the screen, figured out if we tapped on a node, and then got the name of the node. So we're going to do pretty much the same thing. So we will begin by saying for touch any object in touches, so we can get all that information about the touch. We want to figure out where we have touched the screen, so let point of touch equals touch, so this here, dot location in node of self, so where we have touched in the scene. With that, we can figure out what node or what object we had tapped, so tapped node, and that is set to node at point of touch. So if there's a node at where we have just tapped, and if there is, grab the name of this node, so tapped node dot name, like so. So now, using tapped node name, we can figure out if we have pushed on the restart button or on the exit button, because we gave those some names. Okay, so we're going to say if tapped node name, so the name of the node that we just tapped on, equals restart button, so the name of the restart label. Might have to put in your closing curly bracket for you. Doesn't seem to like putting those ones in for us. So if that is the case, so if we tapped on the node with the name restart button, therefore we have pushed the restart button, then we want to move back into the game scene. So let scene to move to will be the game scene. And just like we did when we moved into the game over scene, we will pass it a size to be the same as the current scene. And we will give it a scale mode the same as the current scale mode. So it just looks the same. It's not squished, it's not stretched, no nasty surprises. So that is where we want to move to. Let's set up a transition. So scene transition, SK transition, and this will be how we move from one scene to another. So I'm going to use fade with duration across 0.2 seconds. So our scenes kind of fade into each other. And then let's present the new scene. So we move scene. So let's move to scene to move to with scene transition, like so. Exactly the same as we did when we moved from the game scene to the game over scene a little bit earlier on in this video. So that will now take us back to the game scene when we push on the restart button. What we're also going to do is set up to move back to the main menu scene if we push exit, even though at the moment the main menu scene is blank, but don't worry, we'll make that next time. So making sure you're outside of this if statement, I'm going to say if tapped node name equals exit button, and then because it's pretty much the exact same, we are going to be a little bit cheeky and copy these 4 lines here and paste down into the exit button if statement, and all we have to change is game scene to main menu scene. So now if we push on the exit button, take us to the main menu. So we now have the two buttons set up, which will let us move from game over to game scene or back to the main menu. But there's just one more teeny weeny extra thing I want to add just to polish off the game over scene. And that is going to be, I want to play a little click sound when we tap on a button. It's something I always do when I set up main menus and game over screens. Just adds a tiny little bit extra, especially if you've gone the route of not using a background sound like we've done in this game. Just adds a little bit extra. Okay, so what we're going to do, if we tap on the restart button or on the exit button, we will run this sound effect. Just a really quick little click. Okay, so game over scene. And just like with our other sound effects, we will set this sound effect action up globally, so there's no lag the first time. So game over scene outside of a function, we will say let click sound. This will be an SK action to play sound file named click.wav, the name of our sound effect. Wait for completion will be false. That will not have any impact on this action because it's not in a sequence. So with that, back to touches began, back to our two buttons, inside the if statements, and we are going to run our action click sound in each. So now if we push a button, get that little click sound just to kind of polish it off. And that is now our game over all set up. We have all of our labels, it shows our score, shows our high score, and we can return to the game, or we can return to the main menu, which doesn't yet exist. So let's hit run and check out the game so far. So here's the game. Let's build up a decent score. That will do. So we got 34. Now our game over shows our score of 34, our high score of 34. Now we can restart, and if we get a lower score than 34, the high score will not update. Very nice. So the game over scene is working perfectly. We can move back to the game and play again. Or we can exit back to the main menu, which we don't yet have, but we will make the main menu next time to finish off this project. So with game over now set up, we pretty much have a full game there. It's now very close to being finished, and all that's left is the main menu. So next time we will set up the main menu, polish a few things off, and we will finish this project. How exciting is that? So as always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, which I really hope you did, hit like, hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.